Who makes a monument is an incredible point of debate from my perspective. I think that there's a past, a present, and future to who makes a monument. I think that the actual architecture of a monument is and has been determined by a small set of people. And for reasons that are personal to them. And sometimes it is a reflection of a system of power to reiterate and reinforce who is in power. So traditionally, monuments have been built to honor predominantly white men, right? And I think that the decisions, to do so have been made by the same exact people. Where that needs to go to is a different story, right? Monuments are testaments of history. Monuments are testaments of humanity. Monuments are testaments of a spirit, right? And they should be much more inclusive and much more compelling and reflect the diversity of history that we have within a place.
We know that institutions do, and usually they're propelled to do so because a group of people have insisted that they do. So they are historians, they are archaeologists, they are architects, they are laypersons who see the need of describing or discussing certain stories, certain traditions of a people or a group of people, of a nation.
In the research that I have looked at, the monuments that are the most interesting are those that tend to progress through these official forms of processing. And some of those processes end up being through legislative bodies. So for example, the MLK Memorial in Washington, D.C. went through a committee that was both hosted at the House and Senate levels in the United States government. And this made for a very interesting process because of the ways that public committees were formed, both to engage with the public in a broad level, and then privately through the deliberations within the Senate committee on these particular forums.
Sometimes you can read the plaque of a monument or a memorial and understand who funded it, but it really depends. I mean, there is a history in this country of monuments that have been paid for in large part by the elite. There's also another tradition of kind of early forms of crowdsourcing. And sometimes that brings us stories like the Emancipation Memorial in Washington, D.C., which came out of fundraising from previously enslaved people and shifted gears and became something entirely different. You also have fundraising by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, who instantiated the lost cause monuments and memorials around the country by bringing together the symbols and systems of white racist rule. I think more broadly, something I think about with monuments, and because there's so many differences, you could, in one city, even one city block, you might stumble upon multiple sites of memory that have entirely different funding mechanisms, not just in terms of how they got there, but how they're upkept. Because no monument is permanent. Monuments require maintenance money and mindsets to keep them up.
it's interesting to note the collaboration that exists between private-public partnerships. So in the case of some Southern monuments, organizations like the Daughters of the Confederacy got together, engaged in philanthropical fundraising, and then petitioned the governor or the state to help assist them in raising funds for this. Sometimes this was done independently with the state and these private institutions. Other times they would actually work in collaboration with the federal government and the official preservation arms of the state to figure out what standards were required, either to preserve certain types of public places, turning private houses into house museums, or to establish new monuments, such as the monument to Jefferson Davis that's found in Montgomery, Alabama. So all of those were really interesting because of the types of publics that were consulted to create these spaces initially.
In the case of the street level, neighborhood level monuments, they're funded by the people who create the monument. And I say they're funded by the people who create the monument. It takes labor to create a monument. I mean, I don't care how small or how big it is. That's labor, and labor has a value, whether or not it's paid or unpaid.
I think with the conversation around monuments, people very rarely talk about who makes the monuments, like the sculptors who make the monuments. And that's been an aspect of research that the collective has been getting into more, because it's like, you know, have these been made in a factory? A lot of them were made in Italy, commissioned. And, you know, I think there's something there that I feel is a little bit of a weak link in the conversation in general.
Well, that's a difficult question, I think, because on paper, you usually find one person or a firm of people who are credited with the original design. But in fact, there are a lot of people involved in that process. So usually there is a client who asks for something to be made, and an artist or an architect who fulfills that process. But there's a lot of back and forth and a lot of critique of that final product. And so in that sense, I think that on the front end, there probably is a kind of design concept or design imagination that comes from the hands and the minds of an artist. But they're keeping in mind and trying to consider the ways that both the client and the general public might understand and receive this work.
Who designs and who builds monuments? Well, if you're building a monument today, you're thinking about the artist. You're thinking about representation. You're thinking about equity, and you're also confronting legacies of injustice. But you also are thinking about community, and whether that, you know, community is not a monolithic term. In fact, I always try to think about, if you say you're doing community engagement, I want to know which communities and who are you talking about and with whom are you exchanging. So it's not a one-way transfer of information or extraction, but instead a mutuality and exchange. Community engagement might mean working with a neighborhood association. It might mean working with a group of grandparents who are the stewards of that space. Or it might be a community that comes into existence through the process of building. I think that, you know, when we look back at many of the monuments we've inherited, of course, there are certain artists that stand out, but the monument artist, they might sign their name or inscribe it into a structure, but it was much more the story of what was the figure or the ideal who was being celebrated. And contemporary artists have been pushing the envelope on monuments for more than a decade. And I think that the troubling of a positivist historical narrative, the idea that there's some pure history that lives in a sculpture and it emanates outward, The reason that we're reckoning with that, in part, is the work of artists and of activists, of educators, of students, who have now for the time of a generation, and especially over the last few years, been pushing that. So this question of who builds monuments, who designs monuments, it's actually a composite story in every single case. There might be an artist or an architect or a designer whose name rises above, but whenever you see a monument or a memorial, look for the acknowledged and the unacknowledged systems and networks and coalitions of people.
When I see the Freedom Wall, which is another monument, that the artists who interpreted the different individuals who were on that wall obviously were makers of the monument, but also makers were the people who selected them, and the battles and fights that went on inside of the committee to see who was selected. And it's also a monument to those who didn't make the wall, who should have made the wall. But because of their politics, Albright Knox and others, they just couldn't be on that wall. Assata Shakur, they're not gonna let her be on that wall.
But also it's important to keep in mind that these are repositories of memory. Who are we as a society? What are our values? And how can we maintain traditions, but also talk about the changes that had occurred? How do individuals tell both stories? What do we do with monuments when we find the narrative not quite equating to the so-called American dream and American exceptionalism, democracy? These are issues that can still be debated. And I see monuments too. For example, on our campus recently, Mary Talbert Way was established, and that's an important symbol. Mary Talbert was an internationally renowned human rights activist. And because the Mary Talbert Way encircles the academic spine, it's a site where those discussions about democracy, equity, inclusion are taking place. And that's an important symbol, I think, too, for our constituents, our students.
We thank the people in the neighborhood, the community, the students, and they give it power by making it sacred space. So they don't trash it, they don't try to destroy it. They watch over it and protect it. So it can happen both in a positive and a negative way, as long as it's influencing and shaping the influence of whomever the audience might be. And I would argue that the audience are all of the different people who will come in contact.
But I think that their power also comes from what people place in them. Monuments can become vessels for belief. They can become vessels for political movements, political actions. They can become, I think, vessels for all of our needs and even emotions at a certain given point in time. And whether that means that we're kind of going against a certain way, what a monument might represent, as well as thinking about their potential.
The power and meaning has to come from the audience. And I think this is where in reception theory that it becomes very important to remember this, that a monument has no meaning if people do not read something into it. And that is why so often we see sometimes there's some of the most famous statues and nobody recognizes them. Maybe the pigeons and the birds recognizes them, but nobody does. it is always worthy when someone stops to read the inscription or someone stops to look and to remember. And that remembering too, also remembering means remembering things that we ought not to forget. And sometimes it can be a heinous thing that we want to remember, and something that really hurt the human condition and maybe prevented us from moving forward and being progressive.
And now we're moving to a moment where we realize that we, in a sense, become the monument. I did that literally in a project where I mirrored, boxed over and mirrored a monument. So there was a very literal way of saying, no, we are the protectors and keepers of democracy. If we are the monument, what is the burden of that? What is my responsibility? What is the joy and the celebration of that? So I think there is a shift happening, not enough, where we can decide and claim them. That piece I did on Battle is Joined, it was in Germantown, which is predominantly poor Black neighborhood. And I was thinking, there's definitely a sense of ownership in the park where, like, this is my bench, I can sit on this, is a bench I come to every day. But what does it mean to now say I can claim those objects and I can actually shift their meaning or understand it as a particular moment in history, but understand that there's innumerable histories that are happening around it. And how does that impact my being?
It's incredible. A single monument can have hundreds of people involved in its removal. It's like, once you kind of zoom out and you're like, okay, this monument's been standing for 120 years. It's been contested for, 119 years or something. And then you see like this organization, this activist organization, and then this other activist organization, and these people were involved in like a defacement in 1977. And then now it's being, brought to the city council. And then you think about all the city council members, just the amount of people talking about removing a monument is like actually incredible. Who removes monuments? The thing is that basically, like, even if a city is going to take a monument down, and it's been approved and the gavel's like, hit or something, and it's all very official, none of this happens ever without activists going for that. It never happens without any protests, without people putting themselves on the line, people risking going to jail, people, working their asses off for nothing to make this happen.
But what I will say is that monuments, they change over time. And that includes their placement, that includes their role, that includes the kind of signage and inscriptions that come with it. And we know that, and yet we are attached to the idea, this tautological notion that monuments are there forever because they are monuments. So one, and this is a mundane way of saying it, that monuments move because of the very nature of monuments themselves, because they had to be placed there. There are a number of monuments that have been taken down and toppled, especially those to the Lost Cause Confederacy, and you will find time capsules buried underneath those monuments. If a structure is meant to be there forever, why would you put a time capsule under it? And so I think that that's an agreed upon cognitive dissonance that we all enter into. It's the fantasy of permanence, of endurance, of stopping time, but it's never the reality.